that peace and joy and love. And one of those is usually when we are gathered together with God's family, where we can worship, sing songs, and remind each other of what this life is all about, why we're here and where we're headed. So it's good to be back with you today. Our lesson is going to be from Acts chapter 14, but let's start with Acts chapter 9. In the conversion of Saul. A couple of weeks ago, we were resuming our series, kind of going through Acts, and Paul had made it from this Antioch to that Antioch. That's Antioch of Pisidia, and we had a lesson from there where Paul was in Antioch of Pisidia, and we're going to kind of pick up in that with the story there on his first missionary journey with Barnabas. But I wanted to remind you of something sort of ominous that the Lord said about this in Acts chapter 9. You recall that Saul saw a light on the road to Damascus, and then he went into the town there, the city, and he was waiting, and for 3 days he was fasting. And then the Lord appeared to another man named Ananias and told him to go and look for Saul. And he was worried about that. Remember in verse 13, Ananias said, "Lord, I've heard many things about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name." But the Lord said to him, "Go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel, for I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name." That's ominous, I think is the right word, but clearly Paul is being chosen for a special role. Paul is being chosen for an honorable task, to be the one to go and announce the gospel and bring it to the Gentiles and to nations and kings. That's not going to come without difficulty. And I don't know whether it's interesting because that when you read that, Ananias was saying, "Lord, I've heard about all the things he's done, the evil he has done to your people, and that he's arresting your people." And it's interesting that in response to that, Jesus says to him, "No, I'm going to use him. He's a chosen instrument of mine, and I will show him how much he must suffer." I don't know whether Paul's suffering is somehow tied to the suffering he had also inflicted on others, but certainly he's going to be on the receiving end of the same kind of stuff he'd been dishing out. And he was going to have to experience those same things himself. And he doesn't often speak about that in terms of Paul himself. He does mention it a time or two, his past and what he had been guilty of. But you can't help but wonder whenever he starts to be on the receiving end of that, I'm sure he often thought about the people that he had arrested, the people that he had persecuted when he was on the other side of the fence. So with that in mind, we go back to Acts chapter 13. We began to see some of the things that Paul was going to suffer for the sake of the name of Jesus. When you think about characters of the Bible who demonstrated great faith in the face of adversity, think back to the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's of the Bible, and those people that just had incredible courage to walk into the flaming furnace or to the lion's den. And there's those great accounts, they're so encouraging. And I think today's really ranks right up there with those. It's maybe not as well known as those because those just capture our attention. But I think we're going to see the same faith in Paul as we see in some of those Old Testament heroes of faith. And so we're going to pick up with kind of just to tie it together with where we left off in Antioch. Verse 49 of chapter 13. The word of the Lord was spreading throughout the whole region. But the Jews incited devout women of high standing, and the leading men of the city stirred up persecution against Paul and Barnabas and drove them out of their district. But they shook off the dust from their feet and went on to Iconium. A couple of things that are kind of interesting about that. One of them is that they went to these devout women of high standing, and they got them on their side, and that helped propel this resistance and this push to get them away. And so that shows us that those women had quite a bit of influence in their city as well. But they stirred up these people against Paul and Barnabas, and so far it seems like the resistance or the things that Paul was suffering were just people opposing him and opposing his message. And in this case, kind of running him out of town. But we'll see that it gets much worse than that as we go along. So I'm going to zoom in on this corner of the map here as we continue, just because these cities are kind of closer together. So there's our starting point on this missionary journey, and now we're going to travel down. In today's lesson, he's going to make it down through Derby. And we're going to cover again some of the territory that Evan mentioned in his sermon last Sunday on Barnabas, because that came from chapter 14. And so we'll see that and revisit that as we come to it. So in verse 1 of chapter 14, now at Iconium, they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. So they've come to now Iconium, and as was always their custom, they would go first to the synagogue and they preached there, and a lot of people believed. But now we see that the opposition forces are also at work. And I like that expression. I think it's interesting, I should say, in verse 2, where it says the unbelievers stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds. Isn't that interesting? They poisoned their minds. And you've heard like poisoning a well or poisoning something. They poisoned their minds so that they would be against the gospel. And that really shows us what's at work here. What the battle is for our minds. And that's true all the way back to the Garden of Eden. You think about the Garden of Eden, God created the world, and he created a beautiful place and gave people everything they needed, and he put man and woman there in the garden. And then he communicated to them, and he revealed to them some information, words that they could think about, that they could understand. Do this, don't do that. Here's why you're here. Here's what you're not supposed to do. And then what happens next is that the serpent comes along and he appeals to their mind. Again, he communicates. He questions what God has said. Did God really say this? And then he gives them an alternate idea. You will not surely die. And in fact, you will become like God. So now you have Adam and Eve, and they've been given these two bits of information. And they have to decide which one they're going to believe and which one they're going to act on, and which one is going to affect their behavior. And I think that's really the story of mankind. That's the story of humanity, that we're here, we're living, and we're experiencing these things that God has blessed us with and created us with. We make choices, but our choices are informed by the information that we take in and the stories that we choose to believe. It's informed by what we choose to accept as truth and what we reject as false. And then based on that, what we latch onto and what we believe and what we reject, that determines how we behave and what we do. And so here, Paul comes to this community. They were all living and going about their normal activities. And when he comes in, he's bringing a message, the message of the gospel, the message of Jesus and what Jesus has done. Right on his heels is another competing message, just like the serpent in the garden, saying, no, that's not true. And in fact, kind of somehow, I don't know exactly what they said, but in some way they poisoned their minds against the gospel. So there's these two competing ideas, and people have to choose which one they're going to believe. And the same thing, of course, is true for us today. So that doesn't stop them from preaching, though. In verse 3, it says, they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. Even when we determine that many people's minds have been poisoned against the truth, doesn't mean that we should stop speaking the truth. There was opposing forces there, but they continued to preach boldly. That took a lot of courage in Acts 14, verse 3. And it's interesting that it says that the Lord was working with them. He bore witness to the word of his grace. So he was confirming the word. They were preaching the word, and the Lord was working alongside them, in a sense, confirming the message. And he did that by signs and wonders. And this really was, as I understand it, the primary purpose of miracles to begin with. Look over at Hebrews chapter 2 for just a moment. Hebrews 2. Three and 4. Let's just start in verse 1. Therefore, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard, lest we drift away from it. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, and every transgression or disobedience received a just retribution, how shall we escape if we neglect such a great salvation? It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard, while God also bore witness by signs and wonders and various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. So the message that we have received came first, verse 3 says, by the Lord, and then it was attested to us by those who heard. That's still true today. What we are reading, what we study from, is the testimony, the record of those who heard, those who were the original witnesses, and then those who heard it from them, and then they've written these things down, and the confirmation of the validity and the truthfulness of it was confirmed by God as they preached by these signs and wonders that were distributed according to his will. And so I think we see there the primary purpose of those signs and wonders was confirming that message. And that's happening here as Paul and them are preaching. And you would think, well, that would settle it then. If they've got miracles going on their side, everybody would believe, but that's never the case. It's interesting that people often think, well, if I could just see some sign, if I could just if the Lord would show me something. But what the Bible shows us from beginning to end is very often the Lord did amazing and wonderful, powerful, undeniable things, and yet still a large number of people chose to believe and some people chose not to believe. So even the ones who witnessed miracles, even the people who walked through the sea that was split on both sides, you think now there's a generation that's never going to question God. It seemed like they walked about 2 or 3 days before they started doubting and questioning God. They no matter what they saw, no matter what signs, people still have to choose to have faith. They still had to choose whether or not to trust in God, and then very often they would choose not to. They would reject that. People who saw Jesus do miracles, often some of them believed, some of them didn't. So the same thing is true today. Some people will choose to believe the lie. Let's go back to Acts chapter 14. So verse 4, the people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews, some with the apostles. Remember, we have these two competing ideas. And when an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and stone them, they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. And there they continued to preach. So they hear about this attempt on their life, and so they flee to Lystra and then on to Derbe. And so that's what we're going to see as we continue. Now, when they come to Lystra, verse 8 says, there was a man who could not use his feet, and he was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking. And Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, stand upright on your feet. And he sprang up and began walking. There's sort of a double miracle there. One, whatever it was that was wrong with his feet was fixed. But the other thing is that he knew how to jump up and down and how to walk around, because I would think under normal circumstances, even if you repaired that, you had some corrective surgery or something, it would be very difficult if you'd never walked in your whole life to just learn how to do that. But that the Lord fixed not only his deformity or whatever was wrong with his feet, but also gave him the ability to know how to use them immediately. So that would be a very dramatic sign for the people. And in fact, it has this unexpected effect on the crowd. Verse 11, when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonium, the gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. This is the part that Evan read in his lesson last week when he was talking about Barnabas and doing his character study on Barnabas. And it is an interesting point. What an honor that they said, hey, this Barnabas, he must be Zeus in the flesh. He must be Zeus who's come down to walk among us. And Paul is Hermes. Between those two, Zeus was the boss. Zeus was the king of the gods, the head god at this time in their panoply of all their stories of all that. So it's interesting that when they saw Barnabas and Paul, they assumed that Barnabas was the top guy, and that Paul was Hermes, who was the speaker. And that really shows, as Evan said, that quite a bit of respect and admiration that people had for Barnabas and his role. I think we often think of Barnabas as sort of Paul's sidekick, but I don't think that's the case. I think that they were both powerful men of God. It just so happens that the story is focusing on Paul, but clearly Barnabas was playing a major role in this effort as they go out and they go preaching and teaching as well. So much so that the people here, when they meet them both, they assume that Barnabas must be the Zeus character in this thing. So they, for the Jewish people, their history that goes all the way back, and they knew this, when they saw miracles, they thought of prophets. So when someone came and did some sign like Jesus, they would think, oh, maybe he's Elijah, or maybe he's one of the prophets, because they knew that all the way back through their history, people like Elijah and others were able to do some signs that God worked through them. For the Gentile people, this has kind of a surprising, unexpected result. When Paul heals them, they don't think, oh, he's a man of God. They think it's Zeus or it's Hermes. It's one, because that's what they knew. That was their understanding about, their gods that they worshiped were those kind of things. And so instead of attributing this to the one true God, they immediately think about the gods that they were more familiar with. And so Paul has to put a stop on this. They were going to offer some sacrifice to them. And verse 14 says, when the apostles heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them." So they're saying, we're not gods. We're not who you should worship. We're here with a message. We're here with good news, and the good news is that you should turn away from these things, these idols, these practices they had, and worship the creator of all things. Verse 16 says, in past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways. Yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Boy, that's really fascinating. One of those things I would love to know more about, and we'll just have to wait probably to ask one day. What does it mean that God allowed them to kind of go in after these ways? But he still was watching them, and he was still blessing them. I don't know. But as Paul would say elsewhere, but now he commands all men everywhere to repent. The times of ignorance God has overlooked. I don't know what that means either. But it sounds like there's some grace and mercy in there somehow for all those people who were raised and taught about those things that weren't true. I don't know. It's very, very interesting. But he's saying to them now, look, the creator of the whole universe allowed you to, in some ways down through the ages, believe in all this Zeus and, Diana and all those gods. But now he has, he's given you the truth. And even verse 18 says, even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to him. So the people got it in their heads that they need to worship these two men. But it's interesting how quickly the crowd turns on them. In verse 19, when Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. So they can't decide whether they're going to worship him or they're going to kill him. And that's actually the way it was with Jesus. Remember, on one occasion, he's walking into the city, and they're laying down their garments, and they're waving palm branches and shouting Hosanna in the highest. And it was just a few days later that the crowd was saying, crucify him, crucify him. Now, I don't know how many people were in both crowds. I don't know how many people, were in the crowd that welcomed Jesus, and were those people also some of the same people who later said crucify him. Probably there were some in both, because this just shows us how people can be, they can kind of be fickle in a sense. They can go from, excited in favor of something to completely rejecting it. And again, the difference is, what narrative do we latch onto and what do we choose to believe? But this is really a striking thing as well. I don't want to overlook that they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. When Paul, in one of the letters to the Corinthians, is listing the things that he experienced, 3 times I was beaten with rods, once I was stoned. He was shipwrecked several times, a day and a night he spent in the deep. So this one time that he was stoned, I think, is this one time we're reading about here clearly. And they drug him out of the city thinking he was dead. If he was Just think about how bad he must have been injured. But lifeless. So that you could pick him up by his feet or his arms and just like bump him along and drag him out and just toss him out. Roll over into the ditch or whatever and think that he's dead. I mean, he must have been so badly injured that he was, clearly he was unconscious and unable to even respond or give any kind of indication that he was alive as a result of rocks being thrown. That's just amazing. Imagine, I don't even know how long it would take, how many rocks you'd have to be hit with before you would die. It's a horrible, horrible way to go. But he'd been hit with, they had thrown so many rocks at him that he is basically lifeless, and they've drug him outside the city. Verse 20 says, though, I think this clearly a miracle. When the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and entered the city. So he couldn't have gone from just lifeless to just perfectly fine, I think, without some intervention by God there. So I think it doesn't say it was a miracle, but I feel confident that the Lord healed him and gave him the strength to be able to stand. And what's interesting is when he got up, he entered the city. He walked right back in where they drugged him out. That's amazing, isn't it? Now, it does say the next day they went on to Derbe. So that was all in Lystra. They get up, and if it was me, first thing in the morning, I'd be, before daylight, I'd be headed out to Derbe. But notice what it says in verse 21. When they preached the gospel in that city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch. So these people had stoned him nearly, probably close to death. And yet, as soon as he received his strength, he just walked right back the way they drug him out. And then he left town the next morning, and you think, well, maybe he's done with that place. But after he preached over there, he walked right back, and they walked right into the same city where the people had stoned him to death. And that's why I say, to me, this ranks right up there with the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's and all those people of faith who walked right into the lion's den. In this case, the city there where they had tried and thought they did succeed in killing him. So you might think, well, why would he go back there? But look at what his message was in verse 22. Strengthening the souls of the disciples and encouraging them to continue in the faith, saying that through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. Now we couple that with what Jesus told to Ananias. I will show him how many things he must suffer. Well, Paul's suffering now, and he's definitely starting to experience those things. But he uses that in his message. And so he's encouraging those believers. Remember, there were two crowds. There were some who believed the message of the gospel and some who believed the lie. And now he's encouraging those believers and telling them, you got to stand strong even in the face of persecution. Think of how powerful that message was coming from him who just days before had been stoned by the crowds, and now he's back. He's walked right back into their midst, and he's saying, you guys got to hang in there. It might get tough. People might be against us, but stay strong. And I'm sure that would have been incredibly encouraging, that his own example of standing strong in the face of persecution. One more task before heading home. In verse 23, when they had appointed elders for them in every church, with prayer and fasting, they committed them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And then they retraced their steps. Basically, they passed through Pisidia. That's where that Antioch of Pisidia was, where we were last time. They came to Pamphylia. When they spoke the word of Perga, they went down to Italia, from there to Antioch. And when they had been commended by the grace of God for the work they had fulfilled. When they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done for them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles, and they remained no little time with the disciples. So they retraced their steps back through here, and then from here it sounds like they didn't go back through the island of Cyprus, but they sailed over to this Antioch, the one where it all started with the Holy Spirit. It said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul to the work that I have for them. And they gave a report on their missionary trip, and then they stayed there for quite a while, working with the church there. So this was their first missionary journey, and now they've come to the conclusion of it. And let's consider 4 lessons from this as we think about this account. First is just kind of an interesting one from verse the 23 there, which is that the Lord had them appoint elders in every church. That's really interesting because these were brand new congregations to a large degree. And so you might wonder, well, how did these people have people qualified to be elders when we don't really know exactly the timeline, like how long did this trip take? It might have taken more than a matter of days. I mean, it could have been months or maybe even a year or two. It's hard to say sometimes how long it took, but not generations, not decades. So one suggestion that I think makes a lot of sense is if you had these faithful, devout Jews in the synagogue who had grown up believing in God and had been worshiping God, and when they hear the gospel, they become believers, you would have kind of built in some mature people of strong faith who just needed to know about Jesus and to be, to understand that in order to be already kind of probably mature, sound, now believers in Jesus because they had heard that message. And so I'm sure that factors into this, how they had people who were already qualified. But it also just shows that in every church they appointed elders. And when we went over to Zimbabwe and we were talking to them about this, as I mentioned to you, Steve Klein estimated that there's some 500 congregations, give or take, in the whole country, and he thinks that he's aware of maybe 2 that have elders. And so as we were talking to them about why is there, 500 congregations and only 2 maybe with elders, one of the questions that came up was about the qualifications of elders. Of course, we were discussing that with some of the evangelists, and they had some questions about those things. And as we've talked about here in Lee's class on eldership and leadership and the different roles in the church, to me, as we look at those qualifications and we try to understand them, we try to understand what is the Lord saying to us about these people that we should, that should be appointed as elders. It's clear that they're not some kind of superhuman, person that it shouldn't be that you can hardly ever find one, that it's kind of like this, if you interpret those qualifications in a certain way, you could almost make it to where nobody practically is qualified. If you're very, 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 I don't know the right word to say, but you could interpret them in such a way that you can basically rule out everybody. But we know that would be a mistake because it was the Lord's will, and they found these people in every church. So they should be people you can find. And I think that helps us sometimes when we approach those qualifications and we think through them. Of course, we want to find people who are qualified, but we should understand as we read those and study them and we think about ourselves and we think about the congregation, that these are people that you should expect to be able to find in every church. And I know there are churches here and there are churches, and this church has been one of them for a time, where there happened not to be anybody that was an elder at that moment. I'm not saying that's sinful, but clearly it's the Lord's will and desire that churches be organized in this way, and we should expect that as well today. All right. Secondly, I think it's interesting that there were plenty of times in Paul's life when he avoided trouble. In verse 5 and 6, when they found out about this plan to stone them, verse 6 says they learned of it and fled, like they ran away. Remember, there was another time after Paul's conversion when they found out about an attempt on them and they let them out of a basket and a window and they ran away. Is it okay to run away sometimes? Well, Paul did. He literally ran away from the trouble at times. I think that tells us that there's times if we can avoid trouble, if we know something's happening and we can get away from it, that's okay. You can escape from the trouble that's coming. At the same time, it's also okay to face it head on. There was other times when Paul walked straight into the lion's den. Even in this same passage, we see both examples, where on one occasion he runs away, on another occasion he goes right back where they just stoned him. And we see this even in Jesus. There were times when the crowd grabbed him and he just escaped from their midst. And there's other occasions when he walked straight into Jerusalem knowing exactly what lay ahead. So how do you know which time is which? I don't really know the answer to that. How do you know? It's one of those things I think it's kind of challenging. How do you know when to just avoid a problem? Or how do you know when you need to just walk right into it head on? I don't know. I think there's a time for both. And maybe we just need to pray for wisdom and, pray that God will guide us and help us to know when is those occasions when you need to just, face it and confront it. And when is it better just to avoid the trouble when you can? Finally, it's interesting that even though we've seen that the Lord was working hand in hand in a sense with them, confirming their works, performing miracles through them. There's no question the Lord was working with Paul as he was preaching, and yet he allowed those people to pick up rocks and throw them at him. Now, the Lord could have rescued him. In fact, it seems that the Lord healed him and raised him up and allowed him to continue preaching. If he could do that miraculously, couldn't he have somehow spared him from having to experience that? Clearly, he could have. But why then did he allow Paul to stand there or whatever and feel those rocks hitting him until finally it knocked him out completely? Why did he allow him to endure all that suffering? That's the big question, right? Why do the righteous sometimes suffer? We see it throughout the